Hello and welcome to Chapter 3, Federalism. This chapter we're going to talk about the way that our government is set up between the national, state, and local governments. The U.S. Constitution establishes a system of shared power between states and the federal government. The puzzle of growth in federal power connects back to the debate over ratification of the Constitution. In many ways, the expansion of federal powers has confirmed the fears of the anti-federalists that the national government would be more powerful than state governments. The question is, why have the states and the American people allowed the federal government's power to grow during the past century? The answer is woven around the chapter, but is centered around three main principles. In times of crisis, the federal government is better equipped to handle things. The states, when out of resources, have asked the federal government for help. And centralization of policy helps to solve the states' collective action problems. In federalism, both the states and the federal government are sovereign. The United States was the first nation to adopt federalism as its governing framework. U.S. states enjoy constitutional protection, but most county, city, and other local governments do not enjoy these privileges. In the federal system, the central government shares power or functions with lower levels of government, such as regions or states. These lower levels of government typically will have significant independent power over certain policy areas, such as licensing, like driver's licenses, licenses for cosmetologists or engineers, education, and social problems. Nations with diverse ethnic or language groupings are most likely to have federal arrangements, such as Canada or Switzerland. The opposite of a federal system is a unitary system, where the central government makes the important decisions and lower levels of government have little independent power. In a unitary system, the lower levels of government basically exist to implement the decisions made by the central government. Small geographic areas tend toward unitary systems, while larger, more diverse areas favor more decentralized systems, like a federation, like I said, or even a confederation. Unitary systems are common in many parts of the world. In unitary systems, the national government often involves itself in even the smallest details of local activity. In France, for example, its Minister of Education once boasted that he could tell what all French children were learning at any moment because the central government sent the school curriculum and the time that things were taught. The framers sought to limit the national government by creating a second layer of government, the states. Keep in mind that the U.S. Constitution does not say anything about the local governments. They are creatures of state governments. The U.S. Constitution grants two types of powers to Congress, express and implied. Express powers are those powers explicitly granted to the national government. There are 17 expressed powers found in Article 1, Section 8. These are things like coining money, declaring war, regulating commerce, and collecting taxes. Implied powers also give a lot of important power to the Congress. These are also found in Article 1, Section 8, and these enables Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. This is also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, and has been used to expand the scope of congressional authority. And remember, the federal government also has one other advantage. Article 6 says that whenever there is a conflict between a state and national law, the national law always takes precedence, and any law passed by Congress is the supreme law of the land. This is what's known as the Supremacy Clause. The 10th Amendment helps to preserve a strong role for the states in the federal system. The 10th Amendment states that the powers not given to the national government by the Constitution are reserved to the states. The most fundamental power that the states retain is that of coercion. Coercion is the power to develop and enforce criminal codes, to administer health and safety rules, and to regulate the family via marriage and divorce laws. States exercise coercion through police power, which is more than just maintaining a public order. Police power is the power reserved to state government to regulate the health, safety, and morals of its citizens. It also involves licensing for nurses, doctors, like I said, hairstylists, plumbers, cars, and drivers. And states are also the entity that define private property. These powers related to domestic issues often have much more impact on the daily lives than what the national government is doing. In some areas, the states and the national government share concurrent powers, which is when some authority is possessed by both state and national governments. This allows the states to retain and share some power to regulate commerce and to affect the currency. They're able to charter banks. They can also deny or grant licenses for businesses and professionals, and they can regulate the conditions of labor, including things like minimum wage, work hour, how old you have to be to get a work permit, those types of things. However, when there's a direct conflict of laws between the federal and the state levels, the issue will most likely be resolved in favor of national supremacy. States are expected to honor public acts, records, and judicial decisions that take place in another state. This is known as the Full Faith and Credit Clause, Article 4, Section 1. This means that if you get married in North Dakota, South Dakota will still recognize your marriage. If you get divorced in South Dakota, Minnesota will recognize that you're actually divorced. The Comity Clause is also known as the Privileges and Immunities Clause. It comes from Article 4, Section 2. It guarantees that citizens from outside a state may enjoy the privileges and immunities given to people of that state. So the state cannot discriminate against someone from another state or give privileges to its own residents only. One example of how this works is that someone who lives in Pennsylvania must pay the same car registration fee regardless of whether his or her family recently moved there or has been there for generations. The Comity Clause also regulates criminal justice among the states by requiring states to return fugitives to the states from which they have fled. It's important to note that local government occupies a strange, but extremely important place in the U.S. federal system. In fact, the book states that the status of American local government is probably unique in the world experience. Like I said previously, local government has no status in the Constitution and has always been creatures of the state, and therefore they are subject to control by the states. You can see from this graph that there are over 90,000 units of government in the United States, and only 51 of them, the state and the national, are considered not to be local. New local governments are on the rise as population surges demand more services, including hospital districts, community college districts, school districts, toll road authorities, and utility districts. That's what falls in under other special district. That would also be like your sewer authority. However, even though local states are subject to control by the states, most states give their larger cities home rule, and home rule are powers delegated by the state to a local unit of government to manage its own affairs. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia has home rule, and that means that that Philadelphia can have their own health department and things like that, because home rule gives them a lot more authority. The definition of federalism has changed over time. During the traditional system from 1789 to 1937, the states had more power over federal government, and the system more closely favored the intent of the framers. So during this time, the states did most of the fundamental government and led to stability. Under the traditional system, the state and national relations was what was called dual federalism. It was like a layer cake, and we'll get to more about that later. Each level of government, national and state, was sovereign in its own sphere of police authority, and there wasn't a lot of overlap. The state had a large amount of governing authority, and most of the important public policy decisions affected daily lives that were affecting the daily lives of the American public were made by state governments, like education, taxes, and election rules. The national government during this time was quite small, and most of its functions were aimed at assisting commerce, and virtually none of the national government's policies directly coerced citizens. These were things like national defense and signing treaties with other countries. Federalism contributed significantly to the political stability of the young nation. States made the tough decisions and spared the new country, the federal government from having to make controversial decisions. The national government also, in addition to handling things like national defense and treaties, they also handled internal improvements and raised revenue through tariffs and provided infant industries protection from competition. It also protected patents and provided a common currency. As the nation grew, so did the number of disputes about the power of the federal government versus the power of the state government. The federal court acts as a referee between the national and state governments. The Supreme Court decided several critical cases that expanded federal power and facilitated trade across the states. This removed barriers to trade and laid the groundwork for the national economy. Remember that Article 1, Section 8, known as the Commerce Clause, enumerates the power of Congress. and the Commerce Clause is what delegated to Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. But these early court decisions interpreted the Commerce Clause in favor of the national government. But other than these, and up until the early 20th century and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal policies, the court mainly ruled in favor of sovereignty for the states. These two cases here, McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden, are the two cases that ruled in favor of the national government. And in McCulloch versus Maryland, this ruling affirmed that the U.S. Congress had, through its implied powers, the legal right to charter a national bank. But McCulloch versus Maryland had larger implications. It allowed Congress to use its implied powers expansively, especially as they related to commerce, and it also said that the states could not tax the federal government. And in Gibbons versus Ogden, this ruling established the supremacy of the national government in all matters affecting interstate commerce. But it still left open the definition of interstate commerce, which sometimes would become confusing for the states and have to take it back to the Supreme Court to have to determine different issues. From the New Deal to the present, limits were placed on state governments, and the federal government began to exert more power over public policy than it had prior to the Great Depression. Much of this power remains, despite efforts to roll back national government powers in recent decades. This expansion of federal government power started with the Great Depression, because the Great Depression opened the door to increased federal action when the states were unable to cope with the demands of the Great Depression. Prior to the Great Depression, states and local governments handled the needs of the poor with private charity, but the Depression exhausted all of these resources. FDR responded to the needs of the Great Depression with his New Deal programs. These were financed by the federal government but administered by the states, thus creating a new partnership between the two levels of government, and a much more active federal government, without taking any real power away from the states. In reality, states usually find it very difficult to refuse any funds from the federal government because they rely so heavily upon them for basic services, like roads, to repair and replace roads and bridges, to provide education, and also to provide health care. For example, the Utah State Legislature seriously considered refusing education funds under the No Child Left Behind Act during George W. Bush's presidency, but in the end, they concluded they simply could not afford to fund the state public schools without federal government dollars. One thing to keep in mind as you think about the expansion of the federal government's influence is that it's like putting a genie back in the bottle. Once the states and everyday Americans began to rely on federal aid, they were also subject to their rules, regulations, and priorities. This is where the problem lies. Once you start taking money from the federal government, you get used to that money. So, other ways the federal government can encourage or coerce the states into cooperating is through establishing regulations to guarantee uniformity across the states in areas such as workplace safety, environmental protection, and education, and through the use of unfunded mandates, which we'll talk about that in the next slide. But an unfunded mandate is requiring something and not paying for it, like requiring handicap accessibility in all public buildings. And the states do not like unfunded mandates because they say that those mandates often consume so much of their budgets they are unable to set their own priorities. This new relationship that started with the Great Depression led to a new type of federalism known as cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism, which the layers are swirled then in a marble cake. And remember, dual federalism was known as layer cake federalism, where each level had specific authority. So this new aid was delivered to the states as two types of grants. One was called a grants in aid, and these were grants that Congress provided to state and local governments on the condition that the funds be spent for the purposes set by the federal government. For example, they were used for job training programs or financial assistance to poor children. These grants were used to encourage the states and local governments to pursue goals and priorities set by the national government. In cooperative federalism, there's no clear line of demarcation where one line of government starts and the other begins, like there was with dual federalism. It's still a partnership, but the federal government holds the dominant position because they control the purse strings. But the states are important because they are controlling the implementation, and they can decide not to participate, and If they don't, then the nationally set priorities will not be implemented in their states. This happened with the Affordable Care Act under President Obama's administration, where several states refused to participate. But federal grants in aid are typically awarded as categorical grants or block grants. And the difference is that categorical grants are given to the states on the condition that the expenditures be limited to a problem or a group specified by law. Categorical grants are used when the federal government wants to control state policy. But block grants are given to states and they afford much more discretion. They can typically be allocated to fund a wide range of services, and these give the states much more discretion. So here's our graph that shows dual versus cooperative federalism. You can see on the left that dual federalism is like a layer cake. National government, state governments, very much separate. Under cooperative federalism, you can see how it's a marble cake where the national government and the state governments are cooperating on some policies. So the growth of categorical grants and favorable court rulings led to cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism is designed to encourage states and localities to pursue national goals. And like I mentioned, dual federalism is like a layer cake where the responsibilities are clear and separate. And in cooperative federalism, you not only have national and state governments cooperating, you may also have local overlap also. And if you look at the grants in aid, like I said, it's important to understand this, and I don't want to keep repeating myself, but it's important to understand how federalism has evolved over time. Under the Grants in Aid program, Congress provides an incentive by giving money to the state and local governments if they agree to spend it for ways that Congress specifies. And with regulated federalism, the national government demands higher standards of state and local governments in order to meet those guidelines. And it can be very, very costly for this. And that's where we come to talk a little bit more about unfunded mandates. But as the book states, over time, the Supreme Court has pushed for greater uniformity in rules and procedures across the states. Some national standards require the federal governments to take over areas of regulation formerly overseen by state or local governments. This is known as preemption, and this occurs when the state or local actions fail to meet national requirements, and that's when the federal government will get in charge and will take over and they'll become in charge of certain areas. Now, as federal regulations increased after the 1970s, Washington increasingly preempted state and local policies in many different areas. For example, in 1998, Congress passed a law that prohibited states and localities from taxing internet access services. The growth of these national standards has also led to the emergence of unfunded mandates. And like I said before, these are extremely unpopular with states and localities. An unfunded mandate is a regulation or a condition from the federal government that forces states and local governments to make changes without reimbursement for the additional costs. Between 1983 and 1991, Congress mandated standards in many policy areas, including social services and environmental regulations. These financial burdens became part of a push from the states to reduce the power of federal government. When a Republican Congress was elected in 1994, one of the first things they did was respond to the states' requests and to pass legislation that would limit the cost of federal mandates. Since the 1970s, states have become more capable of administering large-scale programs, and the idea of devolution has become popular. Devolution is the idea of transferring responsibility from the federal government to the states and localities. As I mentioned before, block grants allow states considerable discretion in how funds are spent. This type of grant is seen as a way of reducing federal control. As is the idea of general revenue sharing, which is when one unit of government yields a portion of its tax income to another unit of government. Neither of these programs have been the magic solution to the problems of federalism. For one thing, there was always a trade-off between accountability and flexibility. And all of this is known as intergovernmental relations. This is the struggle between different levels of government and the coordination of action between the levels to achieve that goal. Examples of intergovernmentalism include No Child Left Behind, which was an education program that cut across national, state, and local governments. And under intergovernmental relations, all levels of government are the primary actors in the development of public policy. So if you think about this, states don't want the federal government to tell them what to do, but they always look to the federal government to help for a crisis. Examples are wildfires and hurricanes, when the federal government comes in with FEMA, and we've also seen a federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the states are in the process of getting extra money from the federal government, which then they can give to their businesses or schools or fire and emergency protection companies, things like that. But every time we expand the size of the national government, we also expand presidential powers. And this creates an expectation that the president and the federal government should solve problems. And the media also reinforces this belief by reporting on problems as national problems that seek a national response. There continue to be controversies concerning federalism over issues such as the appropriate size of public school spending, the rights and benefits of immigrants, the government response to climate change, and the regulation of business and moral behavior. But as you can see from this graphic, there are some policy areas where responsibility overlaps, and this is again where the concept of intergovernmental relations is at play. The federal government often tries to influence the shared prerogatives box by offering additional funding for cooperation, or they can also threaten to withhold funding if the states don't cooperate. So keep in mind that a federation attempts to balance the legitimate authority of the national government with that of the states in equilibrium. In a successful federation, when an imbalance of authority occurs between the national government and the states, counteracting forces within the system work to correct the imbalance, much like a seesaw. Although the U.S. national government has grown stronger over time, the states, and often the courts, respond vigorously when the power shifts too far to the national side. So not only is American federalism a work in progress, the power of the national government has also grown, as we have discussed. Other reasons the national government power has grown is, like I said before, the states are not always able to respond, and national elections focus on national problems and solutions for those problems that are sometimes state and local in nature. And also, the vagueness of the U.S. Constitution has made it difficult to check federal power. For example, elementary and secondary education have both been traditionally controlled by the states, but both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama cited stories of failing schools as reasons for their federal intervention into this policy area. And the book also talks about different controversies, including the difference of marijuana laws across the 50 states. Many of the powers of the national government are vague and expansive. Regulating commerce can be and has been interpreted quite broadly throughout history. The Necessary and Proper Clause has allowed Congress to take on more powers, and presidential power has also grown as presidents have interpreted the Take Care Clause and the Executive Power Clause in a way that has allowed them to expand their powers. It's important to note that no single section of the Constitution deals with federalism. The provisions for dividing up power between the national and state governments appear throughout. The most important thing that you can do to affect public policy decisions in a federal system is to register to vote as soon as you can. It's also important that you be an educated voter. Learn about the issues, learn about your representatives. Consume the news from a reputable source. Don't just believe everything you read on social media. Former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. Think about what this means. It basically means that politicians must appeal to the simple and sometimes mundane and everyday concerns of those who elect them into office, regardless of the level of government. Good, safe roads are important at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. Not having a pothole in front of your house is very important to people. And they don't really care which level of government fixes it as long as it gets fixed. Federal and state legislators and local city councils are all elected by the same exact people. It's important for you as a voter to understand how decisions are made at each level of government and how those decisions will affect you. So I recommend that you register to vote as soon as you can and then get involved. So that's it for Chapter 3. If you have any questions, please email me, and I hope that you have a great week. Thanks.